Well, it's an enormous pleasure and a great privilege as well to have been invited to chair this inaugural lecture and hence to be able to introduce to you Professor Elizabeth Archibald, Principal of St. Cuthbert's Society and Professor of Medieval Literature in the Department of English Studies here at Durham. And I have this honour partly because I'm currently head of the English department, partly because I work in the same field as Elizabeth, but perhaps most of all because Elizabeth is not just an esteemed scholar and collaborator, but also a very good friend. Elizabeth brings rare linguistic skills and cultural breadth to her work on medieval literature, and her unique and very wide-ranging scholarship reflects a distinctive and erudite and very international background. She studied classics and then Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic at Newnham College, Cambridge, and she then went to Yale University where she did her PhD. She taught first at King's College, Cambridge, and she then moved back across the Atlantic to Canada for a number of years, where she was Professor of English at the University of Victoria in British Columbia in Western Canada. And she was then lured back across the Atlantic again to the University of Bristol, where she held a chair in the Department of English until she was appointed in Durham in 2012. And by then she had a very distinguished reputation as a scholar of medieval romance and of Arthurian literature, but also for her work on medieval Latin and literary and cultural history. And she's published two, in a sense, related monographs. The first, tracing the complex literary history from Greek romance through many medieval Latin and vernacular versions to the Renaissance of the Apollonius of Tyre story. And this is the story which became Shakespeare's Pericles. If you know that play, you might remember that it starts with a shocking father-daughter incest scene, and it led Elizabeth to write a study, again drawing on her great linguistic, literary and cultural range of the motif of incest in medieval literature. And that comes into medieval literature rather more than you might sometimes expect. And that motif, in fact, isn't unconnected to another of her main research areas, that of the Arthurian legend. And Elizabeth's written on many aspects of Arthurian literature across several languages, medieval and post-medieval. She's co-edited A Companion to Malory and also edited the Cambridge Companion to the Arthurian Legend. And she's currently president of the British branch of the International Arthurian Society. Elizabeth always has colourful topics, as you can tell from her past work on incest, and and her current one is no exception, a project on baths and bathing in medieval life and literature. And it is a project, though it might not sound like it, that's intimately connected with Durham, even if Durham isn't a spa town. And Elizabeth reminded me that she first started this project when she came to a conference on medieval romance, which I organised here in Durham in 2002 at University College. And she gave a paper called Did Knights Have Baths? It was published in the volume of essays based on the conference, which I edited. And in 2012, the Centre for Medical Humanities held a series of lectures and an interdisciplinary project called The Recovery of Beauty. And as part of that, Elizabeth accepted an invitation not just to speak in our series, but to come to the Institute of Advanced Study and spend a term here at Trevelyan College working on bathing as an aspect of beauty. We loved having her here, and it turned out that she loved it too, and that she loved college life. So when she heard that the position of principal at St. Cuthbert's Society was coming up, she applied for it, and who could think of a better candidate for a college principal? She has skills ranging from brilliant party giving to a knowledge of a quite amazing network of eminent people, many of whom seem to be related to her. And she even has great expertise and knowledge of rugby. So, of course, I wasn't at all surprised that she was appointed. I would have been outraged had she not been. But I still couldn't believe and can't believe our good fortune that one of the leading international scholars of medieval romance literature and cultural history, and one of my best friends, should have ended up here. So I couldn't be more delighted than I am to present to you Professor Elizabeth Archibald, who will be speaking today on Baths of Bliss in the Middle Ages, Fact and Fiction.
That was very, very wonderful. Well, Corinne nearly made me cry with that, which is not a good start to an inaugural lecture. I'm hugely grateful to her for being so involved in my coming to Durham on a number of occasions. Neil Cartledge, who is also our colleague in English, reminded me, he's not here tonight, but he reminded me that at that conference in 2002 or 3, whichever it was, he and I, because he was then teaching in Ireland, walked around the cathedral together and said, wouldn't it be a dream to teach at Durham? And now we're both here, so the dream has come true. But of course, the bit of the dream I didn't know about at that point was cuths, and that's been an extra icing on the cake of being here. Are other people waiting to come in? No? All right, we can get started. So, yes, an interdisciplinary project of a ridiculously wide scale is what I'm talking about this evening, and I found it incredibly difficult to cut down the number of pictures I want to show you, because unlike incest, and I'm not being flippant about this, there are, of course, wonderful illustrations of baths. It's much harder to illustrate two people in bed together. You can't tell whether they're related or not. So bathing has been very satisfactory, and it's also evidently crucial to my research that I should go to a number of spas myself and understand spa culture, and I have started doing this with great pleasure, I can assure you. Talk about baths of bliss. Actually, I should say that if you Google baths of bliss, which is, as you'll see, a medieval phrase, the first thing that comes up is a series of massage parlours, unfortunately. And that's actually not irrelevant. So 10 years may seem like a long time to be working on a research project, particularly in this era of ref. But it is a huge and interdisciplinary project, ranging from late antiquity to the Renaissance across Western Europe, with nods to Byzantium and the Arab Middle East. Evidence comes not just from literature and social history, but also from legal, medical, and theological texts, and from archaeology and the visual arts. In order to understand this evidence, I need to read modern works about architecture, anthropology, law, town planning, theology, medicine, etc. And the questions I'm looking at include the following. Do many people have baths in the Middle Ages? Who, how, where, and how often? Was the main reason for bathing hygiene, health, or pleasure, or a combination of some of all these? Was there a continuous tradition from Roman times? How important was Roman influence on medieval bathing habits? Was bathing more popular in some Western European countries than in others during the Middle Ages? What did the Church think about bathing? And how does the representation of bathing in imaginative literature texts compare with the evidence for quote-unquote real life from historical records, legal, medical and theological writings, visual arts and archaeology? I hope you'll forgive me for not having finished this project yet, though evidently life at Cuths also occasionally and very pleasurably gets in the way. So I'm not going to answer all these questions, you'll have to wait for the book, but I'm going to try and touch on most of them briefly with the hope of lots of illustrations. I'm sure you all know that bathing was a central part of Roman culture for hundreds of years. Many Roman villas had bath suites, but what's striking about the Roman world is the extent of public bathing. Every city had a public water supply and public baths, and the entry charges were moderate. The baths were open for rich and poor, free and slaves, and maintaining them was a civic duty taken on by public figures. It was normal practice to go to the baths to meet and make friends, and also lovers, to do business deals and to relax in pleasurable surroundings. This is an epitaph from the tombstone of an ex-slave: "Baths, wine and sex rot our bodies, but they make life worth living." It's a good motto. A friend of mine who's a Roman historian had that put on his tombstone. It's not actually a sentiment that I've found in medieval texts. I think it's striking that in the Roman world, baths are presented as damaging to the body. We might have expected that they were an important part of a health and beauty regime. But as one critic says, for the Romans, bathing was definitely a social event. I haven't found anything comparable to this in the Middle Ages, but I have been staggered to discover the extent of the bathing culture in that period. I'd been working on it for decades before I discovered this. And I might have agreed, till recently, with the pronouncement of a famous 19th century historian that no one in the Middle Ages had washed for 1,000 years. And this very morning, I was teaching at 9 o'clock Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee at King Arthur's Court, and came across a wonderfully relevant quotation where the Yankee makes the same assumptions about Arthurian knights and ladies. So at Durham, we not only do research-led teaching, we do teaching-led research as well. The Yankee says, "And as for a bath, probably neither she nor any noble in the land had ever had one, and so she's not missing it." Well, this is very, very far from the truth. The decline in bathing at the end of the Roman Empire has been much exaggerated. Increasingly, there's been a lot of work done on town archaeology, particularly urban archaeology, in the very early post-Roman phase. And there is evidence of continuity, rather than a major break in tradition. Though, of course, at the end of the Roman era, the infrastructure did break down considerably. There were no slave workers to stoke the furnaces. Some of the aqueducts were destroyed, though actually the Goths rebuilt some of the aqueducts as well when they invaded Italy. And the great public baths, which had held thousands of people in cities like Rome, were no longer used. It was on a smaller scale post-Roman bathing. But medieval baths, as we shall see, were not without sophistication. In fact, there was much more bathing in the Middle Ages than in the Renaissance. Isn't that counterintuitive? If you asked the man on the Clapham omnibus or the woman, I'm sure they'd say, obviously the Renaissance is much cleaner and more sophisticated than the Middle Ages. But it's not true. They bathed much less in the Renaissance than in the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, we have both public bathing and bathing in private houses. As in the Roman world, cleanliness does not seem to have been the major preoccupation of medieval bathers, but rather health and/or pleasure. Roman bathing habits continued into the Middle Ages, though with some changes and depending a bit on location. But you may well say, surely everything must have changed when Christianity became the state religion of the late Roman Empire, and then obviously of Europe after that. Well, in fact, the church had quite an ambiguous attitude to bathing, which I want to explore in some detail. Both high and low status Christians in the early Christian period would have been very familiar with bathing because they were Romans. It was the Roman world, it was part of the Roman culture. And so they would have seen going to the baths as normal and pleasurable. One critic writes that, for the most part, the church was ready to tolerate bathing for the masses if the pleasure component was taken out of it. That is, if bathing was undertaken as a functional, hygienic, and medical activity. So St. Augustine of Hippo went to the baths. This is on your handout. You don't need to, I'll read it out, but you do have that for future reference. He went to the baths for emotional relief when his mother died, and he was very upset. He says, "The idea came to me to go and bathe, for I had heard that the bath, which the Greeks call balaneon, is so called because it drives anxiety from the mind." And that's the apparent etymology of the word, balein, to throw out or drive out, ania is grief. Actually, it didn't work. He felt just as miserable afterwards. But nonetheless, the point is he thought it might work. A very famous Christian leader. Not everyone had such good motives, however. Sicinius, a bishop of Constantinople at the end of the 4th century, apparently went twice a day to the public baths. And when asked by a disapproving, much more ascetic Christian, "Do you really think a bishop should have 2 baths a day?" he replied, "There isn't time for a third." So I'm not sure if that can be counted as medical or not. As the ascetic movement developed, however, in the Christian world, indulgence of the body and concern for physical appearance did become more suspect, and abstention from washing and grooming became a notable sign of holiness. And that tells us something, because if we hear that saints didn't wash for 30 years, surely that implies that other people did. Otherwise, there's no point not doing it. So it can't be the norm. Inner cleanliness became the most important Christian aim. We have numerous fountains and wells and fonts in both Eastern and Western Europe with a palindromic inscription. We've got the Greek here. You can see that it really is a palindrome. It doesn't work in English, or at least I haven't been able to translate it to work. Wash your sins, not just your face. Nipson anomemata, memonan opsin. And this was inscribed on public fountains and fonts and so on. It was John Wesley, I discover, who said that cleanliness was next to godliness. Perhaps other people thought it in different forms, but he seems to have been responsible for that phrase. But of the three religions of the book, Christianity is much the least concerned about physical cleanliness and ritual washing. You don't have to wash before you go to church. And the crossing yourself with holy water that many people do is symbolic. You're not washing yourself literally. It's merely a symbolic gesture. Well, not merely, it's an important one, but it's not washing. Moral inner cleanliness is the big issue for the Christian world, and the most important form of bathing is a once-only symbolic form of washing, baptism. Indeed, in the 1001 Nights, an Arab gardener remarks that Christians never have to wash again once men in black have poured water over them at birth. St. Jerome was an early and influential writer who favoured the ascetic approach and condemned those who were repulsed by the unwashed state. Writing to Heliodorus about the life of a hermit and the ascetic life, Heliodorus was obviously complaining. He says, "Is your skin rough and scaly because you no longer bathe? He that is once washed in Christ needs not to wash again." So the 1001 Nights were right, evidently, in this interpretation. And this is just an image from much later of a bishop exorcising a demon from the baths of Diocletian in Rome. So evidently you can see the demon up in the top left corner. So evidently, in some respects, the church is very concerned about bathing or the culture of the baths. We know that some pious early Christians did stop washing regularly, even when they weren't living in deserts or caves. Melania the Younger, granddaughter of one of the ascetic Roman ladies in Jerome's circle, gave up bathing as part of her campaign to persuade her husband to agree to a chaste marriage. One can see a certain logic to that. Later, however, interestingly, when she became the abbess of a nunnery on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, she requested that a bath be constructed in the nunnery so that the nuns need not go to the public baths. And this is evidence that early Christians didn't entirely reject the bathing culture. They wanted it to be decorous. And this is apparently the first reference to a monastic bathhouse. There are many more through the centuries. The church, it's ironic that it was the church that maintained some of the old Roman public baths in the early medieval period, and indeed later. In some cases as an act of charity to serve pilgrims and the poor and sick. So many people came to Rome, and so the baths were run more like sort of hospitals and hostels for them. And so obviously not just for people to go and have fun and meet lovers and do business. But it's true that the church did make money in some cases from entry fees to the baths, so it's a very ambivalent, ambiguous attitude. One modern writer on bathing notes that, this is a quote, "While they remained heroically dirty themselves, saints frequently washed other people." And we have all kinds of accounts of saints washing lepers and washing people in hospital as a charitable act. The church encouraged bathing for health, even for monks living an austere and simple life in a monastery. Oh, no, I don't want that. This is perhaps on your hand. I think it's on your handout, the next one. I'll go back one. The Rule of St. Augustine from the 5th century reflects Roman bathing habits. This is passage 6 on your handout, emphasizing health rather than pleasure, of course. Because bathing may be necessary for good health, the opportunity to visit the public baths may never be refused. In this matter, follow medical advice without grumbling. Even if a person is unwilling, he shall do what has to be done for the good of his health. But if someone wants to go bathing just because he enjoys it when it's not really necessary, he will have to learn to renounce his desires. For what a person likes may not always be good for him. It may even be harmful. A little later, we have the very influential Benedictine Rule, written about 530, when Roman practices were perhaps no longer quite so standard. And the only reference here, this is passage 7 on your sheet, comes in the chapter on sick brothers. Use of baths should be offered to the sick as often as expedient, but less readily allowed to the healthy and especially the young. Perhaps we should institute this in college. We'll have to think about that. This came to be widely interpreted as meaning that healthy monks should bathe only twice a year, usually at Easter and Christmas. However, of course, these ascetic rules were evidently frequently broken and observed in the breach. As one critic notes rather cynically, asceticism was eventually tamed. Nowhere had such excellent baths and latrines as the grand medieval monasteries. Church laws repeatedly forbid monks to go to public baths or bathe with women present. This suggests that they are doing just that quite a lot, otherwise you wouldn't keep needing to say what penance they have to do. And we'll see some images of this later on. In the plan of the great Carolingian Abbey of St. Gall, there are at least 6 separate bath facilities, some linked to hospital wings, but not all. At the famous French Abbey of Cluny in the 11th century, there were 12 tubs available. Many monasteries had quite elaborate hydraulic systems. There's a marvellous plan, I don't have an image of it, from the 12th century of all the water pipes at the great monastery in Canterbury. Imagine if all the water boards now had really efficient plans of where all the pipes were. It would be absolutely marvellous. And it's a very complex plan. In 12th century Yorkshire, Aelred of Rievaulx's biography, and this is quite close by, of course, tells us that the saint suffered terribly from kidney stones and took up to 40 hot baths a day to soothe the pain, though we are assured that he didn't enjoy them at all. 40 hot baths a day. Can we really believe that? That's an incredible amount of hot water to heat up and carry, and I'll come back to this point a little later. But even if it's a quarter of that, it's still a lot, and it shows bathing facilities were absolutely available and standard if you needed them. So to come back to baptism, it's central to Christian doctrine, but it also represents the Christian adaptation of Roman bathing rituals. In the early years of Christianity, Roman baths were actually taken over for Christian baptism, rather as pagan temples were turned into churches. This served the double purpose of ousting the old religion, but making good use of the facilities. Where special baptistry buildings were built, and many of you will have seen them, particularly in Italy, at first they were designed like Roman baths. The central basin, rooms in which to undress and later lie down to recover, total immersion initially, although of course later that's reduced to just drops of water on the forehead. The Christian church may have had doubts about bathing for pleasure, but ritual bathing was absolutely central to Christian doctrine. Baptism was the most important form of bath for a Christian, and that ritual is extended into other spheres, so that it became standard if you were going to be made a knight, to do vigil, to be awake the night before, to have a ritual bath to cleanse you, and then go through a sort of vigil before you became a knight. It's a kind of secular baptism into the order of knighthood. This therapeutic value of bathing was not lost in Christian practice. It's a form of healing of the soul, but also a symbolic healing, and bathing metaphors remain powerful, as we shall see, in later medieval Christian writing. But they're also in art, and it's been very recently, and I'm ashamed of this, that I've discovered the theme in art, which I'm sure many of you will tell me you knew about all along, of the newborn Christ being bathed at the Nativity. There's a picture of this by Giotto, which we've probably all sent as Christmas cards without some of us noticing. So here is the Virgin Mary, just like any mother, feeling the water to see whether it's okay for the baby Christ, but it's absolutely the standard nativity scene. And there are lots of these images, both from the Eastern and the Western Church. That one's one of my absolute favourites. And we can compare it with an image of the birth of the Virgin, so this is the Virgin herself. And again, I hope you can see down at the bottom, there's a servant feeling the water and holding the baby. Absolutely familiar standard scenes. All the medical treatises say that newborn babies should be frequently bathed. So the baby Jesus is being treated just like any newborn baby, but of course it's also symbolic. It's also a baptismal bathing, so it serves both purposes. So in early medieval Italy, at least, many Roman baths were renovated and continue to be used even under Gothic rule. And in southern Italy, at least, some private houses were equipped with bath suites. One of the most famous lovers of bathing and swimming, as you may know, is Charlemagne, who cited his palace at Aix, Aachen, specifically because of the hot springs there, and liked to bathe and swim with more than 100 of his family and entourage, we are told. That must have been a big pool. In part, this reflects his aspiration to be like the Romans, so he's recreating the Roman world in doing this. But his behaviour is further proof that the church couldn't stamp out bathing altogether, or didn't try to do so. So I hope it's clear that baths, both public and private, were becoming more widely used in Western Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries. They've probably been there to some extent all along, but they then become more popular in the 11th and 12th century. And this may have been in part because the Crusaders saw and admired the culture of bathing and water in the Middle East. But I don't think it's just that. People have said in the past there was no bathing in Western Europe until they saw what was going on in Arab Spain and the Middle East, and then they realized the joys of bathing. I don't think it's nearly as simple as that, but that may well have had some influence. As Roberta Magnusson, who's written on this, points out, it's hard to know whether demand prompted a greater supply of water and bathing facilities in the 12th century Renaissance, when Western Europe was relatively stable politically and peaceful and affluent, and the aristocracy had more time and money to spend on the pleasures of gracious living. Was it that drove demand for more bathing, or it may be that technological developments made it more feasible to have elaborate bath arrangements? Maybe both. There's also a lot of advice about healthcare and bathing coming in from the Arab world in the medical treatises, which are being increasingly brought to the West and translated and acted on. We'll see some images from them in a moment. And they are very keen on bathing at every phase of life. Bathing for new babies, bathing for pregnant women, bathing for middle-aged people, bathing for the old. Everybody is supposed to be bathing in slightly different routines. So the more I learn about actual bathing practices in the Middle Ages, the more surprised I am that there's so relatively little about bathing in the literary texts that I've been studying for most of my career. Or perhaps I just failed to notice them. But there aren't a lot of them. And I'm focusing here on literature from the 12th century because of this 12th century Renaissance, new affluence, new leisure, new interests. Baths occur surprisingly infrequently in the medieval romances which I work on, relative to what we know about real-life usage from arts and historical sources. But I don't think that means they were unfamiliar. I mean, you might say, of course, why bother to mention them? If you read a Victorian novel, you don't expect to hear every time the heroine has a bath, which might not have been very often, who knows? But you don't necessarily expect to hear about that. I think the point I want to make, though, is that it's so clear that bathing is part of gracious living, that it's a thing you put on, you arrange elaborate baths if an ambassador is coming to visit you. We know that people really did this. And yet, particularly in the Arthurian world, there is very little. Perhaps Mark Twain's right, after all, about this and the Connecticut Yankee. However, there are some striking stories, and I want to begin with one which is so complex that I couldn't write a summary of it, so you'll have to take my word for this, though we do have one person in the audience who can confirm this. And this is from a text written about 1200, a continuation of Chrétien de Troyes' story of the Holy Grail. Oh, that's babies having baths. Yes, that suggests that, again, it's quite a common event, quite a sort of standard event, romping in the bath then and now. That's from the late Middle Ages, from 1495, but nonetheless, I expect it's quite representative. And these tubs are so tantalizing. I do wish we had some of them. I think I'm going to need a research trip to Japan to study bathtubs. It's really important for me to understand them, and I clearly can't do it in Western Europe. Anyway, this is an illustration of the first Percival continuation. So this is part of the story of the Grail being elaborated with lots of digressions and side adventures. And this is the story of Carados. Carados and his girlfriend are in the tubs. And you might think that just looks like a jolly bathing scene, but there is much, much more to it. So let me try and get this straight. So Carados thinks he's the son of a king and queen, but he then discovers that his mother has had an affair with an enchanter, and so the king is not his father. So he's very distressed and tells the king. King is furious and locks the queen up, and I can't now remember the terrible penalty he imposes on the enchanter, but it may involve bestiality. It's very unpleasant. His mother is furious, and she arranges with the enchanter, with whom she's still in touch mysteriously, that her son is to be punished. And the punishment is that a snake is going to wrap itself around his arm, and over several years it is gradually going to leach out all his vital fluids until he dies. How do they think of these things? It gets much more complicated. So this happens, the snake attaches itself to his arm. Meanwhile, he's been on adventures and met the beautiful, virginal, charming girl, who is his partner, well, not yet partner, his beloved. Then his mother repents and feels she's been too hard, so she gets the remedy from the enchanter. And here's the remedy, and this is where the bathing comes in. He and the girlfriend are to sit like this, side by side, he in a tub of vinegar, she in a tub of milk. The snake won't like the vinegar, we are told, and it will want to detach itself from his arm and go away. And she is then, and you can't really see this in this particular image, she is to sit or stand with her charming breasts on the edge of the tub, and the snake will want to suckle at her breast, so it will transfer itself. And her brother is to stand by with a sword, and at this moment he will kill the snake. This seems quite... I'm not making this up. Leah can guarantee that I'm not making this up. This seems quite complicated. Anyway, so this is going to happen. And one of the remarkable things about the text is that this girl, who is virginal and innocent and charming, makes a terribly come-on speech to the snake. Don't you see my little white breast? Don't you want to come? For quite a long time. So anyway, so the snake does transfer itself, and the brother is standing by with a sword, but unfortunately, and possibly predictably, as he kills the snake, he cuts off the tip of her nipple. Indeed. However, all is not lost, because on further adventures, the hero acquires, as one does, a sword with a shield with the magic property that any missing body part can be replaced by it in gold. So she acquires a gold nipple. Who could make this up? It's really quite extraordinary. And one of the things that's so fascinating about this story to me is that it combines many elements of texts about bathing. So you've got magic, you've got a sort of eroticism, although very muted, because it's not really erotic, but it sounds erotic in the process. You've got medicine, because in some sense it's a medical cure. You've got a wound that has to be healed. And you've got the danger of death. And these are all elements that come into stories about bathing. So that was a great discovery. And I may say, for the benefit of students here, I discovered this because I was looking at the image bank of the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and I came across the images, and I didn't know the story, and I then looked it up and found this fabulous story. Very satisfactory. A rather less complex but equally striking bath episode appears in a text also in French, but probably written in England a little bit earlier, about the 1180s, which also indicates that bathing was a well-known practice. And again, part of the point of this is nobody says there's this strange remedy that no one's ever tried, perhaps you should do it. It seems like bathing is a completely normal thing to do. It's just a rather weird application of it. So in the next text, we also have health, sex and death, but in a slightly different combination. And this is passage 8 on your handout from the work of the enigmatic woman writer known as Marie de France, unhelpfully, who seems to be one of the very few women in the Middle Ages writing secular texts. And this is called Equitan. It's a short mini-romance. The unmarried King Equitan is having an affair with the wife of his loyal steward. To get rid of the inconvenient husband, the king invites him to share a session of bloodletting and bathing. That's the sort of thing you did for fun in the Middle Ages, intending to make his bath fatally hot. But when the baths are ready, the lovers succumb to lust, the steward arrives unexpectedly and catches them in flagrante. The king panics and jumps into the scalding bath, which kills him, and the steward throws his faithless wife in too. So they're both killed by the scalding baths. So they're not explicit. The baths in themselves are not linked with love or sex, but obviously that comes in here. And the context suggests the link because of the adulterous passion. One of the things that interests me here is that it's plausible that a bath could be hot enough to kill you. It must have been possible to have very hot baths, otherwise there's absolutely no point in having that plot line in the story. And we know that people did go in for companionable bathing. This is from a medical treatise, and here are two people jollily sitting side by side in their tubs, just having a pleasant time. So the notion of inviting your steward to come and have a bath beside you and a little bloodletting as well is not completely outrageous. This sort of thing really does happen. Now, the plausibility of hot baths is confirmed again in one of Chrétien de Troyes' romances, written about the same time, where the link between bathing and love is absolutely explicit, though metaphorical, and this is passage 9 on your sheet. So this is the story of the hero's parents and their romance, and we are told that his mother had been scornful of love, which is always the prelude to a passionate affair in romances, and Chrétien comments, these are the two passages here, 9, 8. Have I got this here? No, perhaps I haven't got this here. I've got it on a slide. No, I haven't got these. Perhaps I've deleted this. Okay, let me read this to you. The poem comments that love has heated her a bath that greatly burns and scalds her. So again, that notion of a very, very hot bath able to scald, but used here to represent metaphorically passion. So producing hot water for all these baths does seem problematic. In another romance, some squires are going to be knighted, 500 of them, and the lady of the castle says, "Let 500 baths be heated." I mean, even if it's 5, that's quite a lot of water. It's hard to know what to make of these exaggerations, but perhaps they represent the luxuriousness of some people's living arrangements and castles, even though that's an exaggeration. It seems a lot of jugs for servants to carry up and down stairs, and we do often see those jugs in images of baths. But we also hear about pipes, And in this passage, the builder of a tower love nest, in another romance, describes all the mod cons it has. This place does not lack baths nor anything that a lady needs. These quarters are suitable for such a guest, for there are bedrooms and baths with tubs of hot water brought through underground pipes. So perhaps as in monasteries, there were quite elaborate piped water systems. We have 13th century accounts for Royal English bathrooms at the Palace of Westminster, which include not only pipes but lion-headed taps, bling bathrooms then as now, and also mats to make the floor warmer when you get out. It may be significant that this particular text is set in Constantinople, which might be expected to have very sophisticated arrangements for water. In the Middle East, the Roman hypocaust system was replaced by pipes, but in the West, tubs seem to have been the norm. I don't have any images of medieval baths supplied by pipes, and to my knowledge, none survive in Western Europe. So what we have is big wooden tubs, we've seen some already, often lined with sheets so you don't get splinters in your bottom, often with sponges to sit on and a stool to help you get in. And in some cases we have accounts for many yards of cloth for linings and the canopies that went over the bath to keep the steam in and perhaps also to create privacy. We have a splendid handbook for superior servants, a kind of etiquette book, which explains how to run a bath for your master. This is very Downton, I feel. So here it is in Middle English. And it's not very difficult to read, but I'll read it aloud. If your sovereign will to the bath his body to wash clean, so it's for washing, hang sheets round about the roof, do thus as I mean. Every sheet full of flowers and herbs sweet and green. And look ye have sponges 5 or 6 thereon to sit or lean. Look there be a great sponge thereon your sovereign to sit, there on a sheet, and so he may bathe him there a fit. And here we have this very scene. Here he is getting out of the bath, he's got his little stool to stand on, lots of people standing around to help him. It's a high maintenance activity this, but there are lots and lots and lots of images of this sort of thing. Nice canopy. Big tub. How much water would it take to fill that? What do you do with all the water afterwards? These are questions I haven't fathomed. I think engineering should do a project and build me a large medieval bathtub, and we could calculate all these things. And we have other images of this kind. This is a picture of the Roman who invented the hypocaust, but he's not, of course, in a Roman-type bath. He's in a very medieval-type bath with his wife, we are told, and they're having a jolly dinner as they sit in the bath with their canopy. Baths in bedrooms, evidently it was convenient to have them. Perhaps it was a warm room in the house. So this is a medieval conception of what a Roman bathing would have looked like, and it's evidently very, very medieval. Here's the poet who was on the poster that some of you will have seen, having a nice outdoor bath with aromatherapy. He's having petals put in. And that, again, was very common. There are lots of recipes for what to put in baths to cure various different sorts of things. We have accounts of plants, other natural objects like leaves and tree bark. And Hildegard of Bingen even has a remedy that involves ants and anthills, though I don't think that sounds very appealing. It's an equal opportunity business. You can be a woman doing this too. Many of you will have seen this in the wonderful Cluny Museum in Paris, an outdoor bath. She's very, very, very thinly veiled in sort of gossamer material. But it's striking in these images how little anxiety about nudity there is. I mean, this is supposed to be one of a series of tapestries that you would hang in your house representing the lordly lifestyle. I find it quite surprising that that's acceptable as a tapestry for those purposes, but there are lots of images of this kind. People at the back may not be able to see there's even a little duck floating on the water where it's running out of the bath down here. This is slightly more problematic. This is in the place for a book where I found it. It was said to be a knight saying goodbye to his wife as he goes off on an adventure. I'm not sure that I believe that. I think it might be Lancelot getting Elaine out of a magic bath. But again, they suggest that these are relatively normal scenes, that this isn't something absolutely startling and unusual. We saw that Chrétien uses the metaphor of a scalding bath to describe the torments of love. But in his romances and most other medieval romances, baths are not usually associated with sex. They tend to be medical or linked to the knighting ceremony or metaphorical. But the erotic bath is a very common idea in other kinds of literature and is much illustrated in medieval art. The tradition that a bathing woman could seduce a man with disastrous consequences is, of course, epitomized in the biblical stories of both Bathsheba and David and Susanna and the elders, much illustrated in the later Middle Ages. In early Christian iconography, David was interpreted as Christ and Bathsheba as the church washing off worldly dirt to be worthy of the bridegroom. That's quite a stretch, I must say. Susanna was the saved soul and the elders were persecuting pagans. These scenes obviously have a didactic purpose, but they also offer opportunities for titillation, which were evidently very welcome given how many such images there are. This is one picture which conforms more with the biblical idea. David's on the roof of his house and he sees Bathsheba having her bath in a tub and falls in love with her. But we move on to sort of soft porn, really. There are a great many images of this kind. There's even one which I don't have here where she appears to be swimming in a castle moat and he spots her there. And perhaps people really did. The ones of Susanna are, of course, more decorous. She's usually not naked. This is my favourite one, which may be a little hard to see. We have the penitent David praying, and down at the bottom you see why he's praying. Here's Bathsheba standing in her bath doing the familiar gesture at the bottom. Athanasius, an early bishop of Alexandria, leaves no room for doubt about the significance of the story. He says, "Learn how women who bathe have been injured and have dragged others down into corruption. The first is Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, who when she stripped, instantly stripped such a great man of holiness and rule. You see how she who wanted to bathe poured out filth on such a man, for because she washed her body, she defiled another man's soul." Even the innocent Susanna, according to Athanasius, was guilty of causing the elders to fall by washing where they could see her. It's always the woman's fault if she's the object of the lustful male gaze in medieval thinking. In the comic French stories known as fabliaux, written in the 12th and 13th century, which focus on human appetites, sex, food and money, and which usually mock conventional morality, baths are a standard part of foreplay. If you're expecting your lover over, you heat up the tub. Life hasn't changed really, possibly all that much. You enjoy it together before going to bed, and if your husband comes home unexpectedly, your lover may need to hide under an empty tub, or someone may get thrown into a tub full of something nasty. There are many variations on this theme in the French fabliaux and in Boccaccio's Decameron. In these stories, it's very clear that bourgeois characters have their own tubs, but they also sometimes go out to public baths. A sort of exception which proves the rule here is this splendid illustration of a story of the three canonesses of Cologne. There are the canonesses, the women ecclesiastics sitting in their tub, and the poet is sort of resisting in the middle, fully dressed, but surrounded by these seductive women. Baths are increasingly associated with illicit sex, and not just in private baths at home. In the very influential Romance of the Rose, there is a passage where the old bawd, La Vieille, mimics an adulterous wife who claims to be ill, and the wife says, "I must go to the public baths. We have 2 tubs here at home, but a bath without steam would be no good, and so I must take a steam bath." And of course she's going to meet her lover at the baths. So that's a major anxiety in the Middle Ages. If your wife says she's got to go to the baths, she's probably going to meet her lover. And an extreme version of this scenario is found in a late 13th century romance in Provençal called Flamenca. It's a very long romance, but once the hero has established that he's in love with a beautiful young married woman, he manages to have an affair with her by taking a room in the inn next door to the baths, and then he tunnels through, and so when she goes to the baths, he's able to extract her to go and have an affair with him in the inn. And there's a lot of detail about bathhouse keepers cleaning the tubs before a high-status client arrives to use them, and so on. Lots and lots of detail. And it's set in a town which is a real spa town in France called Bourbon-Archambault. So most towns, certainly on the continent, had public bathhouses from the 13th century on. In Paris in the 1290s, there were at least 26, and bathhouse keeper was an established profession regulated by a series of rules about opening hours and so on. But in large spaces of the Roman baths, they were much smaller, often with private rooms. Now, these were not always houses of good repute, and indeed, in the Middle Ages, bath and brothel come to be almost indistinguishable. The word stew is used for both of them, coming from estouve, the stoves that heat up the baths. Janet of the stews seems to have been an idiomatic term for a prostitute, and in London, Stewside on the South Bank was the red light district. Sometimes it's quite difficult to tell which meaning is intended with stew, bath and brothel. Confusion about this. One French bathhouse advertised itself as really a bathhouse where ladies could come without any fear of encountering anything improper. But it's very interesting how in the Middle Ages there is a sort of Pavlovian association between baths and brothels. So we have many, many images like this, where it's not just a couple at home, like we saw before, but it's evidently a brothel. There are lots of couples, there are beds in the background, there are many of these. This is a copy, an illustration of a Latin text, Roman text, copied in the 15th century. There's no mention of baths in the Roman text. The illustrator has just thought, a brothel, there will be baths. That's the instinct. Here's another very satisfactory one with a pope and a king in the background. So everybody is going there, everybody's doing it. And of course, if you think about later usage in the 18th century, you get bagno for brothel. It means a bath. There may or may not be a bath, but that word gets carried over into the 18th century. Now, England may have had a lot of stews, but I'm not clear about how much bathing went on. I'm quite worried about bathing in England, both in private and in public. And one piece of evidence is that the great poet Chaucer, who we often think of as describing everyday life in considerable detail, none of his characters who are contemporary have a bath, except some chickens who don't count. They have a sand bath. The people who have baths in Chaucer are Romans. Seneca, who opens his veins in the bath and commits suicide. St. Cecilia, who is boiled in a bath in an attempt to kill her, which doesn't work because she's a saint. And that business of being boiled in a bath as a saint has an interesting ramification, which gave me my title of Baths of Bliss, because there is an earlier life of St. Margaret in which she is horribly tortured by her pagan persecutor, and after having her badly burned, he orders that she be bound and thrown into a deep container of water to drown. Oh, I've forgotten the public bathhouse. This is German. This is a wonderfully phallic furnace, isn't it, or alchemical furnace. And although there are technically men and women in different rooms, one feels possibly not for long. It's also interesting to notice that the person going in at the door has no clothes on. And apparently in Germany, in the later Middle Ages, it was the custom to strip at home and run naked through the streets. And the reason for this may be so your clothes didn't get stolen at the baths, which happened a lot in the Roman world too. Rather lowered the tone. And that's what the prodigal son was doing when he was off being a prodigal son. This is the prodigal son, obviously in a brothel. Sorry, I got behind with my brothel images. And this is one more thing about baths. Charles d'Orléans, a very sophisticated French writer, who says in one of his poems on the pleasures of life, in my view, it's a good and fine activity to sup in a bath and dine in a boat. So again, going to the baths is an absolutely standard occupation, a pleasurable part of life. But poor St. Margaret, being drowned, calls out in this 13th century English text, "May this water become pleasant and mild to me, and grant that it may be for me a bath of bliss." And the Middle English phrase is "bath of bliss." And baptism from the font, sanctification and light of eternal salvation. Secure my soul with baptism to yourself, and with the same waters wash me within, and cast out from me every kind of sin, so your bright bridal chamber may welcome me in. Now this phrase bath of bliss is actually very rare in English, very rare indeed. It's occasionally used in this kind of religious sense. It can also be used in the sense of great joy in some other non-religious context. And there are only a very few usages in that form, and most of them are by Chaucer, and they're about lovers. But because of this earlier usage, because of this notion of martyrdom, where the bath is the bath that kills you will send you to heaven, and is therefore again a kind of symbolic baptism, I do wonder about Chaucer allowing his lovers to talk about bathing in bliss. So if you know the Wife of Bath's tale, where a rapist knight is rescued from execution by a horrid old hag who answers the question that he has to answer, what do women want? Obviously they want complete control, that's the answer. And she gives it to him and she says, but you've got to marry me, that's my price. And he's horrified by this, he's very rude to her, he's very unpleasant and unrehabilitated. And yet, when he gives her control, she turns into a beautiful young woman. And Chaucer tells us, his heart bathed in a bath of bliss. Now, I wonder if we can take that really seriously. If we think that it's a phrase coming out of a religious context, martyrdom, baptism, and suddenly it's being applied to a pretty insalubrious character, is this something subversive? Is there something ironic going on here in using that phrase? He uses it in other places where we might also wonder about that. I won't tell you about that because I'm running out of time. But I think it's really striking that he's one of the very few people to use the phrase and that it does have this background religious context. So, on the continent, certainly, there was a great deal more bathing. And of course, it's part They have a lot more natural spas, natural hot springs. We only have Bath, but on the continent there are masses, and all of you who go to the continent will know that it's completely standard there to go to hot spas all the time. People say, oh, my arthritis is playing up, I think I'll go to the spa for a few weeks. And it's interesting that in the Middle Ages, you find the proverb in various countries, if you want your wife to get pregnant, send her to the spa and don't go yourself. In fact, in German they say, if your wife and the maid and the dog go to the spa, they will all come back pregnant. And I'm told, I don't know if it's still true, but there used to be a phrase in German, where many people, of course, do go to spas, a Kurschatten, who is the friend you make when you go to the spa. So these things don't change. Other people who are obsessed by baths, so we'll move over from that. This is from Prague. If any of you have been to Prague, in the gatehouse on the Charles Bridge, there are frescoes of bathing girls, bathing attendants like this. Wenceslas, the King of Bohemia, was obsessed with this figure of the bath attendant. It shows up in his gate tower. Every manuscript made for him has these images of girls bathing him. That's him in the middle, decorously having his modesty covered with a sponge. But every manuscript has these girls, and they get even more titillating. So that's one of his bathing girls. And this is from I think this is actually from a German text, but some of these images are in a huge multi-volume, fabulous Bible that was made for his wedding. This does seem bizarre, and I haven't read enough, I had my Czech friends translate enough to be sure about this, but I think Richard may know about this, but the argument is, I think, that it represents loyalty, companionship, fidelity in some form, but he's absolutely obsessed with bathing maidens. Well, we've seen a lot about worldly use of bathing, but there is also religious use of it. One critic has noted that all forms of medical treatment invited theological analogy, but the bath, with its overtones of baptism and confession, was especially rich in religious symbolism. This is from a very late medieval or early Renaissance German text, and you have the text that goes with it as passage 16 on your handout, the last passage. So this is an allegory of conversion in which Christ, this is not terribly clear I'm afraid, but Christ borrows the trumpet of a bath attendant. So this is Christ doing what people actually did, which was summoning people to the baths with a trumpet. And here is the faithful Christian arriving. I'm sorry this isn't very clear, but he's then being massaged and cleaned by Christ and soaked in a nice hot bath. So here is the church taking over this popularity of baths and using it as a form of religious didacticism to urge people to confess and repent and be cleansed. So it's not just that the bath of baptism is about the next life, it's also what you do in this life. Not everybody wanted to worry about the next life, of course, and a very popular late medieval image was the fountain of youth. This is a fountain of youth where you arrive old and tired and miserable, and you come out as a supple, charming, beautiful young person. And there are lots of images of the fountain of youth. This is from a castle in Italy near Saluzzo, but a very common theme. Doesn't that look more fun than Botox, basically? Much more satisfactory, I think. But, of course, it might or might not work, and I didn't know. Serious health manuals, as I said, also suggest bathing. This is from one of the earliest vernacular health manuals. And here's someone by himself. He's just having a jolly supper by himself in his bath. You don't have to be with your partner. You can be doing it on your own. It's highly recommended as being very good for your health to have lots of baths. But they can come with problems. So if you're a woman, you can be spied on in the bath. This is from a romance where a man comes and looks through the keyhole, sees this young lady in the bath, sees that she has a very distinctive birthmark, and then pretends he slept with her. Some of you will recognize this from Shakespeare's Cymbeline. It's quite a common theme. So being spied on in the bath can be a problem. And of course, you can also get killed in the bath. This is the Emperor Constans, conveniently wearing his crown, so we know he's the emperor, being murdered in his bath. And I do wonder whether one of the reasons knights don't have baths is you're very vulnerable. And we do know that a number of historical characters were killed in the bath or when they were resting after a bath. So it's a slightly dangerous thing to do. My last slide is a sneak preview of what I hope will be the cover of my book when I finish it, and when I find a publisher willing to put in a great many colour illustrations, which I'm sure you'll agree are absolutely essential. It's perfect because it combines the topics of my last book on incest and this new project. Recognition scenes do sometimes happen in baths in medieval literature, and here is the supreme example. It's Oedipus. His mother is recognizing him by his pierced feet, though I'm not absolutely sure that they are pierced, except in a very peculiar way, where all his toe joints seem very long. I haven't actually checked the manuscript itself, but I cannot believe that the manuscript will say he was in a bath. This is another of those Pavlovian responses from the Middle Ages. They're so keen on bathing that they assume this very medieval pose. I do love the way he's sitting with his legs up, again, just sort of modest. And his mother, looking awfully young, is very worried and looking at him at the recognition. So this is the supreme mixture of my various interests. I think it's unlikely that the bath is in the text. It's an excellent example of the ubiquity of interest in bathing in the Middle Ages, both fact and fiction. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for a most stimulating and invigorating talk. Like Corinne, I'm extremely honoured to have been asked to say a few words on this very happy occasion. Thank you also to the audience for being here. Some of you have come from considerable distances, I know. The people in this room are what I've come to view as a typical St Cuthbert's crowd. Diverse, including students, undergraduate and postgraduate, academics, SCR members, visitors, mixed in discipline, in age, in national origin, in place and type of work, dare I say it, in both height and girth as well. But this audience is also curiously uniform in some critical ways, interested in other disciplines, friendly and welcoming, intelligent and modest in pursuit of knowledge, open to new experiences and ideas, deeply committed to the intellectual development and the emotional well-being of our students. While the primary business this evening is a celebration of Professor Archibald, the world-class medievalist and distinguished scholar, it's appropriate to also take note of the fact that this atmosphere of friendly intellectual dynamism at St Cuthbert's is also very much due to her remarkable efforts. For those of you who have immense stamina, Durham offers an unremitting smorgasbord of fascinating evening talks. St Cuthbert's, under Elizabeth's remarkable leadership, more than holds its own in that wonderful array. Finally, before we congratulate Elizabeth over a convivial glass and wend our ways to, I fear, bathrooms all too often possessed only of a plastic, glass and steel object called a shower, not at all well adapted to the civilized and civilizing habit of reading while soaking, a word about this evening's topic. From the lethal, sly eroticism of David peeking at Bathsheba in 2 Samuel, to the disturbing but entertaining image of young William Shakespeare and his family sharing a bath each May, whether or not it was needed, to a young David Copperfield optimistically hoping to freshen his wits by a cold plunge, to David's death of Mara, and finally to Margaret Atwood's chilling use of baths to depict the totality of Offred's oppression in The Handmaid's Tale, baths and bathing hold a very special place in our artistic imagination. Thank you again, Elizabeth, for a dazzling presentation, both visual and verbal, this evening. Please accept all our congratulations. And finally, thank you again for coming, and I am told through those doors there is a small selection of drinks and canapes that I hope you will all, just here, that I hope you will all stay for and have a chat afterwards. So thank you again.